I would just pick a new term, frankly,
Mm,
because it's like Jamstack was always sort of a bunch of stuff. So
hmm
you can't like cherry pick one part of it and be like, well, that's the true meaning of Jamstack.
Yeah,
It's
there's a lot of baggage there, right?
yeah, and it's like it was what it was, and it meant what it meant, whatever it did mean. I just don't think it has like a ton of meaning now. So it's sort of like just picking a new term.
This is What the Jam, an interview series where we're finding out what's next for Jamstack. Find out more at thefutureofjamstack.org. All right, I'm joined by Kyle Mathews today, creator of
Yeah,
Gatsby. Excited to have you here.
yeah, excited to be here as well.
So let's start off with a big question. What is, at this point in time, what does Jamstack mean to you?
Um, that's a great question. I mean, like Jamstack was not ever our term, like Gatsby wasn't. Gatsby sort of predated Jamstack, uh, and then Netlify started pushing it a lot and stuff. So I mean, I always kind of saw Jamstack as kind of this like umbrella term for like there's a lot of things changing in how we build websites, uh, and so we'll just sort of lump all those things underneath this as sort of like this because it really like kind of like the 2013 to 2019 or whatever was just a whole slew of stuff changed.
Yeah.
Like get based development was like it's hard to remember, but it was like pretty novel to a lot of people then. CI/CD was like super novel to a lot of people. Um, you know, that was kind of the period in which like jQuery went from completely dominant to sort of like server side rendered stuff with like decoration of jQuery to full blown JavaScript apps, which talked over API to backends. Um, so just like a massive amount of change kind of happened all at once. And, static sites became a lot more viable, part because of the CI/CD, part because of, headless CMSs. So there's just like a whole bunch of threads happening. And so Jamstack, like it was just sort of an attempt to be like, hey, here's like, we're kind of drawing a fuzzy line around all this stuff and kind of marketing them all together. But it never quite made sense to me because each of those things were like had their own names and
Mm.
and they kind of evolved by themselves. And it sort of felt like Jamstack was like this like temporary convergence of a bunch of stuff. And then since then they've either gone like mainstream or they've like died out or they've kind of gone on and developed their own life of their own. So it's kind of like it's like you try bundling together a bunch of stuff that don't inherently go together necessarily, and then the bundle just kind of fell apart as they kind of like went off. It's kind of like a bunch of cars all come together on a highway and then they start peeling off going different directions or something like that. It wasn't like a singular thing. It
Yeah.
was just a good name for the moment. That's how I see it.
Yeah. That's a good analogy. So how do you, let's go back to the origins of Gatsby. Like
Uh-huh.
what was going in your mind that led you to creating Gatsby? What were you saying?
Um, yeah, I mean, it was a few different things, kind of like all those I was saying. It's like, React was and is still just like a massive leap forward in kind of building UIs. Just like the easy encapsulation of state behaviors, styles, and components is way better than what we had before. And so, um, having used React pretty early on for quite a while before I designed and built Gatsby, I was like, okay, React is just wildly better, and everything we do on the web should be done in components. So kind of was like Gatsby was like, okay, React is awesome. How do we bring it sort of traditional websites, like more CMS type websites? Um, that was the main logic. There also was, like static sites, pre-built static sites. Um, uh, was also like a big part of it, and so that was kind of like most websites can be run in this fashion, And if it fits within that paradigm, it's like a lot simpler to run. Because there's just all these things you don't have to worry about. You don't have to worry about traffic spikes. You don't have to worry about operations nearly as much. There's just a big reduction in complexity. And so that was like a very appealing thing to me as well. And I mean, still is. Like, I don't run any sites other than static sites still. So, yeah.
So it's really trying to pair those worlds together, the static world and the React world.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And yeah, I feel like Gatsby was really a big shift in like that umbrella term, because it started off as like
Uh-huh.
the Jekyll and Hugo's of the world, and then
Uh-huh.
once Gatsby was in there, suddenly it opened up all these new possibilities around like
Uh-huh.
actually building applications
Right.
with that kind of mindset. Like, is that how
Right.
you saw it? Where Gatsby was really part of that shift?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, um, yeah, the idea is like React is the best way to, decompose UI problems into kind of like small little component sized problems. So it's just a faster, more efficient way of building stuff. Uh, and yeah, the beautiful thing about React is like, and I design, and this was the intention with Gatsby, is that it solves sort of normal staticky site problems really easily. But if you want to add interactive elements, then everything is already set up for you. It's trivial to kind of go beyond the website. Um, you don't need to do anything strange to like start adding like sort of interactive islands, within the broader site. Yeah, and that thesis definitely held true because yeah, it was like Jekyll was like, okay, cool, like you have your blog, but like what else do you do with it? Where yeah, with Gatsby, it's like you can do the normal, straightforward, like put pictures and text and whatever on the page, but then any other requirement that comes along, it's not some sort of big shift. You can solve that as well. And so people doing more ambitious, powerful stuff, saw that and like that a lot. Because yeah, like simple tools that do simple things well is great, but if you're operating in an area where there's a lot of unknowns about what requirements could come down the pike, it's very scary to get kind of like boxed in by the simple tool. You need something that has sort of the power, flexibility, whatever, to tackle any sort of problem that comes your way without having to like re-architect something in a big way.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you have an example of that, of maybe something you built, or like customer examples of that? I'm just curious to dive into that a little bit.
I mean, sure, like our own website was an easy
Yeah,
example because I mean, it had our whole dashboard for our commercial kind of Gatsby Cloud running inside of it. Because, with Gatsby, you can have the marketing pages. Like we had all our marketing pages, we had all our docs, we had, yeah, that's basically it. But then, like, we just like /app, or I guess dashboard actually was what we did. Anyway, /dashboard was then a client side application. And with code splitting, if you didn't load, so if you hit a marketing page, you didn't load any of the code for the SaaS application.
yeah,
But once you went there, then it kind of was like pulled in, and then then did API calls, and off it went, running all that. So, um, uh, yeah, so that's just like a ton of power um, for people building these sort of like hybrid type stuff
yeah. And
that
then you
you
can
weren't really,
share
yeah,
components between all these different use cases, between docs,
yeah,
marketing site, application. It's all just the
yeah.
same
Yeah,
world.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. Because a lot of people in the past, you'd have entirely different tools for your docs, for your marketing site, and your applications, and so um, they just didn't stay in sync. One team would be like, "Oh, we're going to change this stuff," and whatever. And so what Gatsby and Next and other tools built around React is that everyone can just have a React component library, and then share that across all their different you know, systems.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
So so
Yeah.
if we go back to before you were talking about multiple streams, um,
Hmm.
and Jamstack trying to be that umbrella across them,
Hmm.
how would you describe those like distinct streams?
Yeah, I mean, the ones I was just 2012 to 2018, 19, whatever, 20. I mean, yeah, it's like get based operations,
Yeah.
CI/CD. So get based operations just meant that you know, everyone, everything was like everything you did was like checked into code. Um, and you had kind of a consistent workflow around like proposing changes. Normally people with like pull requests on GitHub generally, and so it just gave industry wide. Everyone had like a very similar workflow around how do you propose changes, how do you view them, how do you test them. So just a whole slew of tools kind of baked themselves on top of this flow of Git based stuff. And then CI/CD also then was part of that because yeah, you had the sort of the you put up a pull request, you test it, and then when it's merged in, then you deploy it
Mhm.
automatically. Um, and like that'd been like a thing for. I mean, I remember reading like in like the late 2000s, there were people starting to do that, and it was like heavily heretical because you're like, oh, you got to like have a manual release because what if something goes wrong, blah blah blah, whatever. But it's just so much more efficient if you don't have all that. So anyway, so there's a lot of yeah. So I mean, there's just needed to be a lot of tooling and to make it viable to do the continuous deployment. And so that's kind of like, like Netlify and Gatsby Cloud and Vercel and Render and Heroku. A whole bunch of other people built sort of those tools to make the preview automatic deployment systems work well. And yeah, and they just got like, once they got good enough and people kind of wrapped their head around like, oh, like this is safe and it's tremendously more efficient, then they just exploded in popularity.
Yeah.
Um, and then just like JavaScript, like so sort of in the front end space, the JavaScript tooling, uh, it used to be extremely bare bones, like
Yeah.
when I started my web career, best practices was like rummaging around SourceForge or something and
Yeah.
downloading files. You're like, I hope I got the right one. And you download it and then you like, link it with a script tag and stuff. And like, I remember brunch in like the 2011-ish or whatever. Uh, there was some sort of pre-npm npm type thing that would like you could specify which SourceForge files you want to download. So when you ran like sort of the install, it would download stuff for you. And then brunch was like a very very simple bundler um, that just sort of concatenate together stuff basically. But that was like a huge leap forward. We were like, oh, this is so much better. Like we can like
Yeah.
see a list of which libraries we're using, and it'll put them together in one file instead of like downloading 27 different jQuery plugins. Uh,
Sounds familiar.
so yeah. So it's like, anyways, there's just like it's just like it's just like startlingly primitive compared to what we have now with sort of these fancy Rust-based compiler, whatever. Anyway, we have all this sort of like supercharged, turbocharged jet engine, space age JavaScript tooling now, and all that developed like in the last like 15 years, um, and yeah. Anyway, so yeah, it's just gotten incredibly more. Yeah, and so because then like all the tooling, because there's so many people building stuff, uh, there's just this whole virtuous cycle where then like lots and lots of new libraries have been written, and so like it is really hard to find a problem now that there isn't like five good libraries or something out there, and so
Yeah.
you know like it went from like writing lots of stuff yourself to now you just like look on npm and you're like, oh, I'll evaluate four different options and see which one I like best. And um, so yeah, so it's just like just a lot of sort of stuff came together and created this sort of virtuous cycle where a lot of open source and commercial tools kind of got built really fast over the last while. Um, and yeah, I don't know. It's like I look around now and I'm like, yeah, things are amazing. Things are great. Like I don't really have a lot of complaints anymore about how things work.
Yeah. When you were when you created Gatsby, did you think of it as like under the umbrella of Jam? I guess it predated Jamstack, so you weren't thinking about that at all. But did you see it as something like an evolution of Jekyll and Hugo and those more static things, or were you more like this is something new and it's kind of in its own category?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely thought it was like similar to those, but they were like the immediate pushback from sort of people in that camp was like, oh, Gatsby's too complicated. Gatsby has like too much JavaScript. It's like there's like we had Webpack baked in, um, and so yeah. I mean, there's sort of this like yeah, yeah. I mean, like a lot of static site stuff was like very focused on just almost bare bones simplicity, um, where uh, with Gatsby, I was like, I want to make a trade off with like it's still pretty simple,
Yeah,
but it's like a lot more power baked in.
yeah,
It's like, which makes it like, it was more complicated. It was harder to use, for sure. But yeah, it's like the thing is like with Jekyll and whatnot. Like they're all like fine and dandy, but it was like it's kind of hard to use for anything other than like very simple stuff. Um, but it was incredibly simple for those very simple stuff. So I mean, that's like valuable. But I wanted to like, okay, if you want to do something ambitious, you're never going to pick Jekyll. It just
yeah.
wouldn't make a lot of
I
sense.
think Gatsby was the first framework that really broadened people's minds, I think, in what was
Yeah,
possible with this approach
yeah,
to web
yeah,
development. And I think it was like the catalyst for modern web development that we see today. Is that how
yeah.
you see it?
I mean, I think that might be overstating. I mean, Gatsby got a lot of attention, so I think maybe a lot of people are exposed to ideas. I don't. I mean, I feel like we invented a few things with Gatsby, but like, uh, I don't know. Like frameworks are like they're more like the evolution of ideas as people just do one-off stuff, a bunch, and like a lot of people like whether it's small companies, big companies, somebody's like, I have this like really specific problem, I have this weird brainstorm, and they do it, and then they log about it, and a few other weirdos, like they're like, oh, that's cool, I'm gonna try that too. Um, so there's sort of this long gestation period of ideas. They're just kind of like circling around like uh, small groups, but most people don't hear about them until they're kind of like wrapped up in some sort of product
Yeah,
that then makes all these ideas sort of coherent and accessible. Um, because yeah, I mean, Webpack was like a thing before Gatsby, but like I think we helped, make it a lot more popular because like Webpack used to be like ridiculously hard to get going with. Uh, but with Gatsby, it was like all kind of enclosed behind, you know, the boundaries of Gatsby, and like you could extend it with like plugins, that would add different functionality. Uh, and so it went from, you can think of like how many details did you have to understand in order to like make something successful, and it went from like 100 down to like, without Gatsby to like 10 or something.
mm.
And so, and it just meant that the audience like for this stuff grew a lot. So
Yeah,
anyway,
makes it more
yeah,
accessible.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So
You kind of alluded to this before, but where do you think Jamstack fell down and just became kind of yeah, it lost its relevance in web development, or do you think it was never particularly useful?
I mean, it was sort of, it had its point. It was kind of like, hey, there's all this stuff happening, but it wasn't ever in my mind like a super coherent term. And
Yeah, what?
so
Because of
it was
because it was so
it was kind of
stretched.
no, it was just like it was just kind of saying like, hey, you can build stuff with JavaScript now or something. It's a lot easier. I mean, it was just kind of was like it was just kind of like things have changed uh, in a big way, and it was the name that people gathered around,
Mm.
but no one could ever like really pinpoint
Yeah, agreed.
exactly what it was because it wasn't like anything. It never was anything in particular. It was just kind of like, hey, things are better and different, so like check it out. And then, but it was such a broad tent that it wasn't like any one thing necessarily. Uh, I don't know. It's like I mean, it's like any idea or any sort of practice loses coherence over time. Like, I mean, I was just actually talking to a friend at lunch about like DevOps, and he was like, "Oh, like what's?" He's not really an engineer, so he's sort of like, "What's what's going on?" He was just like, "What's going on with DevOps?" And I was like, "Well, it's actually not really a thing anymore, um, because everyone just kind of does DevOps. You don't need like you don't there isn't like as many DevOps specific engineers because you know pre DevOps there wasn't as nearly as much sort of automation and
Mhm.
setting up and running your infrastructure. And then all of a sudden there's like a bunch of tools that kind of came out that let you do that. And then there's like conferences, and then like a lot of people hired DevOps engineers. But then over time,
Whoa,
those
where are the
balloons.
balloons coming from?
I don't know where the balloons came from. Anyways, it's like over time, it just became like how you build stuff, and like the
Mm,
tools got really mature, and it just was like, everyone just sort of expected to. If you're a backend engineer, it's like you write some Terraform code or whatever. There's not like a person on the team who has to like do all this work to become an expert at it.
yeah,
And so yeah, so I think like Jamstack, it's kind of like, hey, come over here and learn Git. Come over here and learn like JavaScript. I remember Matt Mullenweg was like, yeah, thumbs up. I remember Matt Mullenweg, was like telling WordPress developers like everyone should learn JavaScript. But in 2024, it seems really obvious to say you should
yeah,
know JavaScript. So like, why would you even tell anyone that? And like, it's like telling somebody you should really learn to use Git. It's like a good
yeah.
analogy is what's that movie? Some movie from the '60s that's famous. Uh, anyways, there's this fresh grad. I can't remember. Anyways, there's this fresh graduated college student, and like he's like comes from a wealthy family or something. He's at this like graduation party thing with a bunch of his parents' friends, and one of his parents' friends is like sort of drunk and pulls him aside, is like plastics. You should get into plastics or something like that. And he's like, okay, thanks. But anyways, it's like in the '60s, plastics was like the future.
Yeah.
It's like people talk about like what is the future, but like what happens when the future becomes the present? It's just it's just reality. It's just like what we're around. You don't really talk about. We don't talk about the most common stuff. We talk about things that aren't common but might become common.
Yeah. I
Um,
mean, just to go on that analogy, like I feel like in the 50s, the ultimate of future is the screen in your house that you can
yeah,
talk to another screen in another person's house and see their face.
right.
That's mind blowing. And now it's
Yeah,
like
yeah,
I can do that when I'm in the park. Like it's beyond what
yeah,
they could have imagined back then.
yeah. I mean, I just don't even talk to people without video. Generally, I'm like, what's the point? I don't really like it. Um,
Yeah.
so like Jamstack is like it didn't fail. It like Jamstack won. So now that it's won, it's like uh, yeah. I mean, you can like recycle the term to kind of like point to something else, sort of in the future that needs promoted, or it could be like something. yeah, so there's a couple possibilities. Like either like you sort of like rejuvenate it towards like pointing towards some newer idea that still needs pushing, or if there's something that was like part of Jamstack but didn't go mainstream, or has lost mind share to kind of like sort of rejuvenate that sort of thing. So um, yeah, I mean a lot of people are like, oh, like sort of the simplicity that Jamstack was about is not there as much anymore.
Yeah.
Or at least people don't talk about like the value of simplicity as much. There's sort of more. A lot of the emphasis is on like tackling complicated stuff, and so I think like pushing the narrative like, hey, yes, there is very large, very sophisticated sites, but 95% of us aren't working on those, and so our lives would be better suited by more simple tools. That sort of constrain what they can do, and thereby constrain sort of your freedom in ways that reduce the odds of you accidentally shooting yourself in the foot, sort of thing. It's like tools that are simpler are safer. They're not going
Mm.
to like. Uh, anyways, yeah. So I think, um, but 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 yeah. I mean, but I would just pick a new term, frankly,
Mm.
because it's like Jamstack was always sort of a bunch of stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
you can't like cherry pick one part of it and be like, well, that's the true meaning of Jamstack.
Yeah.
It's
There's a lot of baggage there, right?
yeah, and it's like it was what it was, and it meant what it meant, whatever it did mean. I just don't think it has like a ton of meaning now. So it's sort of like just picking a new term could be a lot
Yeah.
simpler.
What do you think about that idea of simplicity? Like, do you think that's something that's relevant in like today's web development? And not giving it a
Of
name,
course,
but yeah, do you think there could be
yeah. I
something
mean,
like Jamstack there?
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's like uh, you know the ideas progress sort of through revolutions and counter revolutions. There's
Yeah,
sort of this dialectic, boop, 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 whatever, kind of going back and forth. So, um, you know, tools become popular, and then people are like, "Oh, this is like constraining us," and like we were doing this new thing, and so we need to kind of like develop this other thing, and then that gets a lot of people excited because they're like, "Wow, it's like all this new opportunity," but then they're like, "Okay, now it's become so popular that we're using it for like." Because like it tends to be like you create a new thing, a new tool is created in order to make the experience better for building one sort of stuff. But then if it becomes so popular, then it's just sort of the thing that everyone learns. And you kind of lose sight of what it was even built for originally. It's just kind of like, it's the thing. And
mm,
so I think it's then useful to be like, no, actually, like, let's look back at the history here. It's like, that was actually built to solve this one particular problem. And it does that really well. No one's going to say otherwise. But if we all go in on that, then we're losing the value of the previous thing. So there's sort of like, we start here and we counter revolution here, and then this thing kind of moves up and being like, okay, let's like use the strength of, so there's like tool A, tool B is a counter revolution, and then A can then shift to C where it's
yeah,
not like A anymore, but it's like C is sort of it's like learn from both A and B. It's like, well, okay, like it's like whatever the value of A is, how do you like recreate the value of A? How do you re-express the value of A in today's day? Because like you can't roll back the clock, but you can design something that captures what was valued in tool A. So like so I think that's like really valuable to do. Um, the other trick though is like uh, kind of difficulty in this area is this is just that there's yeah just like there's a lot of money that came into um, building dev tools. So it used to be in the past there was like no money in JavaScript, and so any JavaScript tooling was because somebody really needed it.
Mm-hmm.
But then two things happened, which is that all the big tech companies invested like a ton of money
Mm-hmm.
in supporting all these things because they needed them to build ever more sophisticated tools. And the other, of course, is that then just because like the SaaS revolution, there's like enormous number of people building web apps. Then VC money came in to fund tooling, to then fund all that stuff and whatever. And so it's yeah, it's just like a noisier space to make headway and to kind of push something. Um, so yeah, it's like crafting a narrative that's like coherent and appealing to a large enough group that they can be like, oh wow, I actually do identify with what you're saying. Uh, that's me, even though I didn't know it's me. That's the type of work I do. That's what I appreciate in a tool. That's my kind of values that I have and we have at our company. Like that's the type of value we're trying to like provide, or if if you're doing agency type stuff, like that's the kind of value we're trying to provide. That's the kind of craftsmanship that I care about. Whatever. So I think it's the job is like if you're going to do some sort of counter revolutionary movement, it's like articulating being the voice for a large enough group of people that it kind of like creates momentum, um, and gets other people supporting it, uh, and spurs because it's like the engineering world is a big world, so it's like to make anything happen, it's like it's got to resonate with a lot of people. It's got to lead to podcasts like this one. It's got to lead to conferences, blog posts, a lot of people talking about it, and so on. So um, yeah, so it's like what's going to resonate with people strong enough to make all that happen is the question.
Yeah, it's a great point. Let's finish on that one. Actually, I feel like that's a good point to finish on.
Yeah,
Kyle, thank
yeah,
you so much for joining today. This is a great conversation.
yeah. My pleasure.
That's it for today's interview. Find out more at thefutureofjamstack.org.